we can start if you guys want. Yeah. Okay, I think that's a concession.
Yes.
All right. So, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Dr. Muhammad Al-Ali, CEO of Trends Research and Advisory, I would like to welcome you all to this session. It's a great honor and pleasure for Trends Research and Advisory to take part in the GIJU Peace Forum. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sultan Al-Rabi'i, and I'm a researcher in the Economic Studies section at Trends Research and Advisory. And I'll be the moderator to today's session, titled The Abraham Accords 2 years later, Assessing the Impact and What Lies Ahead. As the title suggests, today's topic will dwell on bringing together different regional and scholarly perspectives on the Abraham Accords 2 years later. The Abraham Accords' main purpose is to promote tolerance and cultural dialogue in the pursuit of peace, security, and prosperity in the Middle East. This diplomatic initiative has often been formulated and viewed as key to maintaining and strengthening peace and stability in the region, while furthering collaboration in areas of mutual interests. With efforts to encourage coexistence between the people involved, the pursuit of cooperative relations between Arab nations and Israel has also witnessed numerous initiatives and developments in spheres like business, technology, defense, and environmental affairs. With that, I'd like to introduce our esteemed speakers for today's session in the order of their presentations. My colleague, Aliazi Al-Hosseini, Deputy Chief of the Media Sector at Trends Research and Advisory, Dr. Tobias Bork, Research Fellow for Middle East Security Studies with the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies, Dr. Brandon Friedman, Director of Research at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University, Professor Yossi Mickelberg, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House, Mr. Jonathan Panakoff, Director of Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Before I leave the panel to our speakers, I would like to inform everyone that Mr. Panakoff wanted to join the session. However, due to travel commitment, he sent us a pre-recorded presentation, which will be presented and integrated to this session. And at the end, we will have some room for questions and open discussion with the speakers. Speakers, the panel is yours. Yazi.
Assalamu alaikum. Anyo asayo. Shalom aleichem. Kavod gadol liot kanetchem hayom. Peace be with you all. It is both an honor and a privilege to take part in today's discussion and to offer perspective on the Abraham Accords as a model of the new diplomacy in the Middle East. But before anything, I would like to thank Trends Research and Advisory and the GIJU Peace Forum for giving me this opportunity. Distinguished speakers, audience, and friends. It has been 2 years since the signing of the Abraham Accords, during which I have visited Israel more than once, and have likewise had the opportunity to observe the positive impact of the openness to Israel and its people on my own society and the societies of neighboring Gulf states. The common denominator between the both nations is that we both hold the Middle Eastern identity. But the central question remains is how can we use that similarity to better build the idea of peace to those that disregard the transformation shaping the world around us and prefer to repeat the same tired slogans as though they were inescapable fates. In the region, riven by war and conflict, never before has the type of cultural diplomacy being introduced and reinforced by the Abraham Accords been more important. Through culture, we can help bridge gaps, reduce mistrust, and build a new Middle East with a brand new identity and spirit. Cultural diplomacy reveals the search for common values and principles that bring together people from different cultures and even religions. On that theme, it is my great pleasure today to describe the fruits that we are beginning to see and witness of the success of culture and society exchanges, and also briefly address emerging trends we hope to see grow over time into a prosperous and stable friendship. First, as many have noted, the normalization of diplomatic relations with the 4 Arab states in 1 year itself sends a clear and positive message that as nations and cultures, We value peace instead of conflict, and together we wish to sow the seeds of mutual tolerance and trust. Second, going beyond symbolism to set out a practical scope of the people-to-people engagement and the treaty notes itself. The parties undertake to foster mutual understanding, respect, coexistence, and a culture of peace between their societies in the spirit of the common ancestor Abraham, and the new era of peace and friendly relations ushered by this treaty, including the cultivating the people-to-people programs, interfaith dialogues, and cultural, academic, youth, and scientific and other exchanges between their people. Indeed, the agreement itself holds substantial promises precisely because both parties recognize the need to reach out on a societal level, not just a governmental one. Third, the scope of the normalization of ties between the UAE and Israel is largely youth-focused, which therefore means it is future-focused. The language of the text includes references to cultural and student exchange programs, art diplomacy, sports diplomacy, and most importantly, the likelihood of emerging a new Middle East identity. In fact, one of the most significant achievements of the Abraham Accords is the opportunity for academic collaborations between universities, research centers in the UAE, the neighboring countries, and Israel. I believe such collaborations can enhance the people-to-people connections we are all looking for and provide the solid foundations necessary for present and the future economic and governmental cooperation. However, it doesn't receive the proper attention in the media as we think it does. Right now, there are many areas of academic and research cooperations between the two countries, which includes student exchange, joint research projects, exchange of academic best practices, mutually beneficial events, which include water management, food security, and environmental issues. Scholars and experts from the two countries collaborate in areas ranging from economy, business, education, psychology, medical research to artificial intelligence, geopolitics, international relations, and security studies. Collaborations did not start from scratch. The UAE and Israel researchers have co-authored 248 papers between 2017 and 2019, according to the Scopus database. Scholars from the New York University in Abu Dhabi, NYUAD, have previously partnered with researchers in Israel and other countries before the announcement of the Abraham Accords. I also want to touch on the fact that in October 2020, Trends Research and Advisory in Abu Dhabi and the Mushi Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University signed an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, which includes carrying out of cooperative projects in geopolitics, economy, and intercultural relations. It also organized the first joint conference with an Emirati-based think tank that focused on the Abraham Accords. Future collaborations are also likely to focus on artificial intelligence, science, as well as agriculture, desert studies, water security, cybersecurity, and energy. Fourth, the scope of collaboration stretches even to include fields such as tourism, the arts of sports. For example, Israel took for the first time in Ras Al Khaimah Fine Arts Festival in March 2020. Art diplomacy is a tool that has been used by the Emirates and Israel to help change the values of the Middle East to be more tolerant and accepting the other. Also, a great example is the Dubai Expo 2020, which witnessed the first Abraham Accords Festival and Games, a day-long event planned and hosted by the government of the UAE, bringing together national soccer personalities and top chefs from all around the world and Abraham Accords. The event sought to deepen cultural cooperation, as well as the people-to-people ties that was connected by the Abraham Accord countries. Finally, I would like to also highlight the role of education in breaking down the long-held biases and the misinformed taboos across societies by all age groups. Education is a bridge to a better future and a milestone towards success and progress. In order for cultural diplomacy to succeed, practically it needs to include first and foremost the acknowledgement by political and religious leaders that peace, justice, and mutual respect are the basic values in all religions, as well as a central assumption in international law and diplomacy. In conclusion, I strongly believe, out of my personal experience, the youth can be the bridge to a better future through new values, through the track number 3, through the diplomacy, through cultural diplomacy. But fortunately, the Abraham Accords has created a new culture in the territorial space of the Accords countries, which is the culture of the people-to-people connections. Based on the people-to-people relations, cultural diplomacy can succeed in building a sustainable peace and developed Middle East. Peace cannot emanate only from documents signed by the leaders alone, but from mutual goods, faiths, and credibility among the people from whom the agreements are signed. Thank you very much. Tudaruba.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alyazia, for your contribution on the topic. And now we leave the floor for Dr. Tobias Bork.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to join this very timely discussion and to join it in the company of such distinguished fellow speakers. I've been asked to talk a little bit about my assessment of the impact of the Abraham Accords on the security and foreign policies of various states in the Middle East region. I think firstly, it's sort of important to highlight that I think the Middle East regional order is going through a profound transformation. And I think the Abraham Accords are both a result and a driver of this transformation. And they represent a regional rather than an external answer to the complex security dynamics in the Middle East. I think there are a number of big questions that are sort of around when we think about the regional order in the Middle East over the last 10 years, but also most importantly, looking ahead to the next 10, 20 years. The biggest of all of them tends to be what the role of the United States is in the region, right? The United States has, since the UK left the region in the early 70s, the United States really has been the upholder of regional order. Doesn't mean that it was always peaceful, that the United States always resolved all problems, by no means, but it was always there as the sort of, without question, most powerful, most engaged external actor. And that is clearly changing and has clearly been changing over the last 10 years. And so whether it's about the United States right-sizing its position in the region, whether it's about withdrawing from the region, whether it's finding a new way to engage, all of those are, at the moment, I think, still open questions and will remain so for the next few years to come. In the meantime, we've seen over the last 10 years, Russia re-emerging, not just as a neighbor to the region, but as, I think, a real security actor, right? Which is, of course, raising concerns in some parts of the world, and in others, it is potentially showing up an alternative. Then we have China, the big economic actor already, and clearly the big economic partner for the future, and particularly for the Gulf states. But a big question over to what extent China will engage in the region as a security actor. And then we have Europe, right? Europe, this potential behemoth, if you will, and clearly an economic power, but with far too many question marks around its willingness to do anything in the security space, right? And now I've talked all about the external actors, because in a way they do shape the global environment in which I think countries in the region are determining their own foreign and security policies. And for me, at least, even though, of course, the United States was deeply involved in the Abraham Accords, the Abraham Accords are really a manifestation of a drive from the region itself to come up with new ideas for the regional order, right? We have these tired cliches of, could there be a Middle East NATO, right? I think that's the wrong way to think about it, because it suggests that there is some kind of external thing that is going to be put into the region that solves everything somehow. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I don't think the Abraham Accords are a Middle Eastern NATO. I think they are something uniquely Middle Eastern, just as my previous speaker has discussed as well. And so I think as that is happening, as countries in the region are thinking about how to engage with the many different challenges in the region, but also think about how to potentially capitalize on what are quite obviously many opportunities, whether it's in the economic space or just in the human, potential of the region. I think I see the Abraham Accords as clearly one part of that. I do think there are some big questions around the future of the Abraham Accords, because I do think it remains to be seen to what extent the Accords can be part of a truly inclusive approach to regional security and order, as opposed to part of a regional alliance building specifically designed to keep out or counter other regional powers and actors, right? At least looking at it from the outside, and you will all be very familiar with this, looking at international media coverage, the Abraham Accords are often portrayed as an alliance building against Iran, right? It's about how can the region, how can countries like the UAE, like Israel, like potentially one day Saudi Arabia, how can they work together without external support from the United States in order to counter what they perceive clearly as a threat to regional security in Iran, right? So are the Abraham Accords about keeping someone out? Are they about building alliances against? Are they defensive? Some might even suggest, are they offensive? So I think that those are open questions that need to be addressed, I think. And in that addressing of those questions are also questions around to what extent other regional powers fit in, or other regional players fit in, right? Is there space for Jordan in the Abraham Accords? Jordan, which has had a peaceful relationship with Israel for by now almost 30 years. But I think felt somewhat left out, certainly in 2020 when the Abraham Accords were signed. And so what is its role, right? Does it really have to deal with yet more suggestions that couldn't Jordan be Palestine, right? Or can we have a conversation that actually moves on from that? And in that, of course, the big elephant in the room will always remain to what extent the Palestinian question can be addressed within the framework of the Abraham Accords, right? Or are the Abraham Accords intended to be a way of shifting the conversation from the Palestinian question to something else, leaving it almost behind? Or can it be taken along? So I think those are questions that need to be addressed. And those are only the biggest ones. I think you have other ones about how does Syria fit back into a regional order? How can there be a regional answer to something like a problem like Lebanon is experiencing? To what extent is, our conflicts and problems in North Africa to be addressed through a framework like the Abraham Accords? I think all these are huge and hefty questions. But I think as countries are thinking about their foreign and security policy going forward, as they think about how the Abraham Accords fit into it and how they might shape the Abraham Accords going forward as well, since they're not a finished product at this point, I think that will clearly be one of the absolutely defining dynamics of the regional order in the Middle East over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tobias, for giving us an insight on the security side of the Accords. And now we'll go to Dr. Brandon Friedman. Dr. Brandon.
Thank you. First of all, let me begin by thanking Trends Research and Advisory and the Jeju Peace Forum for having me join this event. It's both an honor and a privilege to speak to your audiences. My thanks as well to Alyazia, who I had the privilege to know while she was in Israel last year. And it's really, truly a historic moment, not just for Israel, but for Tel Aviv University and the Moshe Dayan Center. And it's an honor and a privilege to be able to be here with you today. Let me begin by, like any good academic, by qualifying what I'm about to tell you before I tell you it. First of all, I'm not necessarily an expert on Israel and the Arab world, which is a topic I'm going to talk to you about. And a distinguished professor of Hebrew University, Ali Podeh, has just written an 800-page book about Israel's relationships with the Arab world, its secret relationships with the Arab world from 1948 to 2020. But I think as a scholar, as an area studies expert, as a scholar who focuses on the Gulf, and as an engaged citizen of Israel, I can probably tell you a thing or two about how the Abraham Accords are resonating, but certainly my perspectives are simply my own. Let me begin by stating the obvious. For Israel, the Abraham Accords represents a true sea change in its relationship with its neighborhood. I use the expression neighborhood instead of the Arab world for two reasons. One, I think it's hard to think of the Arab world as a politically coherent entity. I think it's quite diverse in political terms, even though in cultural terms, I think there's still strong arguments to be made that there's definitely an Arab world. And secondly, we in Israel in the past have sometimes used a very dubious expression as Israel is a villa in the jungle to refer to our neighborhood. And I would hope that with our new relationships in the Gulf, we come to retire that expression as a thing of the past and recognize that our neighborhood is far more complex than perhaps we've depicted it in past decades. Now, the reason I say the Abraham Accords is a sea change for Israel is that it offers a kind of positive engagement, which Aliazia talked about at length in her comments, a kind of positive engagement with its neighbors that we have failed as yet to achieve with Egypt and Jordan, whom we both have made peace with. This kind of positive engagement that the Abraham Accords offers can be seen in 5 key areas. And in many respects, I'm going to be echoing some of the things Aliazia already said, but I'm going to frame them somewhat differently for reasons I think that will become evident. First is, and Tobias, I think you referred to this, obviously the positive engagement strategically that the Abraham Accords offers is one that's been talked about at length in the international media, meaning the strategic convergence between Israel and the Emirates and Bahrain and others in the region regarding what's referred to in some quarters as the Iranian threat, but I would say not just the Iranian threat. When Israel and the Emiratis get together with Bahrainis, we often also talk about other threats, like things like radical Islam, but not just, and I'll talk about the other threats as well, which are often underappreciated. Secondly, the kind of positive engagement the Abraham Accords offers in areas like trade and investment, in which there are huge numbers that we in Israel could not have dreamed of just a few years ago. The third area is technology and infrastructure, and I'll talk a bit about that as well. Now, oftentimes you'll see trade, investment, technology, and infrastructure grouped together, and you could say as part of the positive economic engagement of the Abraham Accords, but I think it makes sense to separate them out, and I'll also try to explain why. The fourth area of I would say of positive engagement with the Abraham Accords relates to the questions of energy transition, what's talked about a lot in the Emirates as net zero, and obviously the climate crisis that we're collectively facing, not just in the region, but globally. And finally, last but not least, is the people-to-people aspect, which Aliazia emphasized, which is perhaps the most important opportunity for positive engagement between Israel and its neighborhood. There are those who would argue that there is a clear-cut distinction between Israel's state-to-state relationship with the Emirates or Bahrain or Morocco and its relationship with those societies in the neighborhood. And there is some doubt, there's no doubt there's some measure of truth to that distinction, but they tend to oversimplify a very complex reality and ignore the powerful role that the state plays in shaping people's perceptions about Israel and its century-old conflict, or more than century-old conflict, with the Palestinians. I think that those arguments that say that there's a clear-cut division between how states and Israel relate and how societies in Israel and how those societies relate to Israel often underestimate 2 powerful forces for change in the region. One, Aliazia alluded to, which is the youth and the demographics we see in the region. The region's youth has a very different living memory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than the past generations that we've often focused on. And as a historian, I'm very much aware that the role of one's living memory plays an important role in regional dynamics. And secondly, and equally importantly, I think that the opportunities for true interpersonal interaction and communication between Israelis and members of our neighborhood gives us an opportunity to know one another on an individual basis, the way I had an opportunity to meet and get to know Aliazia last year, but it also gives us an opportunity to humanize the other. And I think that that's something that we've lacked both in Israel, but also in the region over several decades. A great deal has been said about Israel and its neighbors' dispute with Iran and Iran's nuclear program. And I imagine a great deal more will be said in the coming weeks if indeed a new nuclear deal emerges. I'd be happy to discuss these issues, the strategic issues, in more detail during our discussion. But for now, I'd like to focus on some of the other dimensions regarding Israel's relationship with its neighbors. And I'll only briefly dwell on them because I know time is short. And I think Tobias, you alluded to a few of them, but I just want to put a sharper point on them. It's important to understand that Israel's relationships have changed in the region as a result of the Abraham Accords, and that these changes happened at a particular point in time with a very specific context. So I just want to review 5 key elements of that context, and then I'll leave the rest for discussion. One is the Abraham Accords emerged amidst a global pandemic. And I think it's important to understand the broader, longer view of how the region perhaps perceived the effects of that pandemic in real time. And Tobias, you alluded to the big question mark regarding the US's role in the region. I think that's just one dimension of it, but certainly perhaps the most important one. Secondly, the pandemic unleashed a much sharper global rivalry, particularly between the United States and China. And more recently, we've seen that sort of great power competition unfold in the Ukraine. So I think that, again, this sharpened great power rivalry is also a factor in the context that led to the Abraham Accords. Third, and I think perhaps the element that's least appreciated when the Abraham Accords is discussed, is the fear of deglobalization or reglobalization or regionalization. Tobias, I think you alluded to that to some degree. Whatever your favorite buzzword might be, I think that the concerns regionally about things like supply chains, the potential for sustaining global trade, and things like the 4th industrial revolution or the digital revolution were all drivers creating, I would suppose, opportunities for the Abraham Accords. The 4th dimension, again, one of the least appreciated ones, is a recognition that when we talk about security, there are new dimensions to security, whether it's public health, whether it's food security or water security or climate security. And also, obviously, the one that's most appreciated today is questions relating to energy, okay? All of those new dimensions of security give a much sharper logic to the Abraham Accords, which isn't talked about nearly enough in my estimation. And 5, the 5th and last point, and then I'll stop, I think relates to indigenous defense development. The idea, yes, that there is strategic convergence with respect to Iran or radical Islam, but there's also a desire, given what I mentioned previously in Tobias, which you alluded to, the question marks with respect to the United States, there's a sense that there's a will for the region taking responsibility and control for its own security. And I would say that that is a distinctly new phenomenon that is worthy of much more discussion. Thank you all for your attention. My apologies if I've gone on a little bit longer than I planned. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Brandon, on your contribution. And you actually stated like very important questions as did the others, and we'll keep it for the discussions. So we'll go to our next speaker, Professor Yossi Mickelberg. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for my previous speakers. You wonder sometimes when you have 2 presentations that cover so much what you can add to the conversation. I'll try to do my best. Good evening to the distinguished guests. It's great honor to be invited by the organizer of Trends Symposium, the Forum for Peace and Prosperity, inviting me such a highly important symposium on a topic I think we maybe haven't discussed enough in the last 2 years, maybe because what you mentioned, just you, Brent, mentioned pandemic and other issues that took over. So it's almost became an obvious thing. Yeah, there is an Abraham Accord, and maybe it's worth discussing it more details, and it's a great opportunity to do it here. Because 2 years is a long time in politics, and in Middle East, it feels sometimes like an eternity. And I think many of us, when we first heard the news about the signing of the Abraham Accord, we both were surprised, but at the same time, it feels like it was something in the air for years, almost a natural progression as the sign of rapprochement between Gulf countries and Israel took different forms, and for an array of reasons reflected of commonality, of convergence of interests were just mentioned. And if we look back at the last 2 years, and so much has been said earlier, and especially by you, but the kind of all this range of issues of collaboration, the idea of people to people. And if you look at the staggering figures of trade, that's only, you know, in 2021, $1.2 billion between those who signed the Abraham Accords of trade. And already in the first 7 months of this year, trade between Israel and the United Arab Emirates has reached 1.4 billion. This is an addition of the scientific and cultural and education cooperation. This represents normalization in every sense of the word, something that in principle, it should be something that is should get the EU support wholeheartedly. You would expect that this is part of the EU DNA to look at such normalization, but it's not the case. And the focus of my presentation here is why the EU, especially when it comes to the Abraham Accords, is missing in action. And at the end of the day, the formalization of the Abraham Accord has opened the door for a major reconfiguration of the political and security makeup of the Middle East by broadening the scope of all these countries in the region to cooperate. And it isn't completed yet. It's actually something that's waiting for other countries to join in due course. Now, despite the normalization of relations, one should not be deceived to believe that there is a complete overlap in interest and in approach to all the challenges that these countries meet. And I think both Brendan spoke about Iran, and how it's going to pan out in the next few weeks. That's going to be crucial, and assuming that the accords actually make them all aligned in their interest and the way they're going to approach it will be a bit far-fetched. And as far as I think also Israel and the UAE, it's still, despite differences, also showing determination and commitment to develop their relation, and by that enhance their roles and position in the region and global sphere. But then there comes the question, and that's where the EU, why the cold reception? And to a large extent, this comes to what you, Tobias, mentioned, the elephant in the room. Because at the end of the day, what is there, what is missing here is what can be done about the intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to bring it to a fair and just solution. And this, whether it's in the relations with the Gulf and other countries in the world, this hangs as a cloud over the Abraham Accord and also stops it from seeing its coming to seeing its full potential into fruition. Also, it has already been tested due to at least 2 rounds of hostilities between Israel and Hamas, or Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and it survived with only minor scratches, but such stress points are bound to continue. And the deteriorating condition in the West Bank and Gaza and the issue of Palestinian President Abbas' succession when it happens will pose severe tests to the robustness of the Abraham Accord. And the EU, and I have to say, when I talk about the EU, I'll include the UK as well, because when the Abraham Accords were signed, the UK was still part of it. And where the UK foreign policy going, it's a good question. We'll see. We have a new prime minister. But As such, the EU welcomed the normalization of relations between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, later Morocco and Sudan. Yet it was something of a more subdued greetings. It might be the case that it didn't like being caught by surprise by the main protagonist of this agreement, and especially its close ally, the United States. So one has to acknowledge that when I say close ally, it's the time of President Trump, what Europe and the United States didn't see many things eye to eye. And not unrelated, only 2 months before a watershed election in the US, as it was the case then, Brussels was probably reluctant to easily hand President Trump another valuable card in this election. It preferred not to embark on songs of praise for this achievement. Now, I think we should make a distinction between the formal and official response by the EU to the Abraham Accords and its more standoffish approach to it in practice. It decided intentionally to be a bystander, instead of being an active participant in supporting it and advancing it. Formally, in the immediate aftermath of the signing of the accord, Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, in a rather quite succinct press release, welcomed the normalization of relation between Israel and the countries of the region, and also emphasizing the long-standing partnership of the EU with both the UAE and Israel, and envisage the benefits to all countries involved and for the stabilization of the region. So all this sounds very well and very promising. But actually the longer part in this press release, immediately then in August, 2 years ago, 2020, he hastened to express Europe's commitment in a much longer passage in this press release to comprehensive and lasting peace for the entire region and the EU readiness to work to this end together with other regional and international partners. The EU made an instant connection between normalization and the need to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, fearing that one of the most valuable cards to leverage on Israel's policy towards the Palestinians was played too early. And in principle, the EU has been in tune more with the Arab Peace Initiative, which was endorsed in 2002 by the Arab League, and then in the Beirut summits, and then re-endorsed further twice in further summits, which the crux of it was one of offering normalizations of relations between the Arab world and Israel in return of full withdrawal by Israel from occupied territories and a just settlement of the Palestinian refugee problem. In other words, normalization follows settling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with it all the outstanding issue between them, and not the other way around. So now we are facing two paradigms, one that normalization first and the other normalization second. What actually came as a major source of relief for Brussels at the time originated in the Abraham Accords, what it averted Israel declared intentions to unilaterally annex large swaths of land of the occupied Palestinian West Bank. And efforts to bring a solution to this conflict had suffered from innumerable unilateral action, mainly by Israel, by annexation, even parts of the West Bank, which might have anyway stayed, and probably in any peace agreement to stay part of Israel, doing that unilaterally will probably hand a fatal blow to any future agreement. We, of course, don't know for sure if Netanyahu generally meant to annex part of the West Bank, as is usually Netanyahu's world. Promises are done, especially before election or through the process of forming coalition to serve his own political interests. But it was definitely something on the table, and something that could have caused irreversible damage. Now, still 2 years later, the EU Special Representative for the Middle East process, in one interview to Arab News in Saudi Arabia, and then in a op-ed in Haaretz in Israel, talks again exactly the same thing that worried the EU 2 years ago. So in principle, there is no rejection of the Abraham Accords. They see the value of it, but they don't see how it weaves together with solving the Palestinian issue. And this is the EU dilemma in all of this. Now, going back just in conclusion, if we look at what is the EU DNA, you go back to Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman and the Schuman Declaration. It's all about normalization following conflict. And to be honest, the UAE never been in direct conflict with Israel. So unlike Europe that suffered from hundreds of years of war, let alone in the first half of the 20th century. So you always expect that the first to endorse it would be the EU, because seeing the ability to move from a state of conflict to a state of normalization. But I think for the time being, this is not the case. And the EU should also take some of the responsibility for that, especially since a new administration came to power in the United States. So in many ways, if under the Trump administration, there was a point in what the EU, Brussels argued that now it's blocked any possibility of advancing peace process, there was actually the opportunity for the EU to leverage both having a different administration in Washington, using the normalization that's represented by the Abraham Accord, and to bring an EU initiative for peace, and then bring all of them together, which is again within what, because the Abraham Accords represent the way that the EU sees bringing countries together. But sadly, in some, this hasn't happened, and the EU is probably preferred to be on the sidelines instead of being both in the peace process, in the Abraham Accords, a major player. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Yossi, for sharing your reflection on the Abraham Accord and actually offering a European perspective on the topic. And now we will actually show the recording of Mr. Jonathan Panikoff.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Panikoff, and I'm the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Let me begin by thanking the Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity and Trends Research and Advisory for inviting me to be part of the E-Symposium. I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk about the Abraham Accords, their impact thus far, and future possibilities that may emerge from their implementation as well. I'll begin by discussing progress made since the Accords were originally signed 2 years ago. The most prominent progress was made at the Negev Summit at the end of March of this year. It was a pretty remarkable summit when considering that it was pulled together in 48 hours, something almost unheard of for a multilateral conference. But that summit really kicked off the opportunity to discuss exactly what the Abraham Accords would mean in real terms. And so in June, we saw foreign ministers from countries that had signed the accord send representatives to Bahrain, where they ultimately developed 6 working groups: clean energy, education and coexistence, food and water security, health, regional security, and tourism. And since there's also been discussion about the potential for a 7th group focused on trade. What these categories really represent are not just theoretical areas for potential work, but what will become the foundation for the broader relationships between Israel and Arab countries who have thus far signed on to the Abraham Accords. These working groups don't just set the stage for potential collaboration between governments and private businesses. They have the potential to be much more impactful, especially for everyday citizens. On food and water for security, for instance, Israel leads the world in recapturing rainwater, the recycling of wastewater for which it treats and is able to use 90% of it, the use of water gen machines that are able to pull humidity right out of the atmosphere, ultimately creating thousands of liters of potable drinking water per machine per day. This is in addition to advancements in the food supply, for which Israel leads the world in drip irrigation and has been at the forefront of the development of drought-resistant crops. All of this technology represents opportunities to not only deepen bilateral relationships created through the Abraham Accords, but could help relieve the pressure on some Arab states especially non-oil exporting ones such as Morocco, by ensuring sufficient potable water and food. That, in turn, is a critical factor in helping to assure the stability of these countries. Even working groups like education and tourism have the opportunity to help strengthen long-term regional peace. One of the fundamental problems is that for many ordinary citizens in Arab countries, they've simply never met an Israeli and have a limited view of them, aside from often poor depictions of Israelis and Jews in educational texts and on Arab media. But the Abraham Accords are an opportunity to change those texts, to no longer be anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, which combined with the opportunity to meet Israelis in person as they come and visit and tour the great cities of the region, whether Dubai or Abu Dhabi, Marrakesh or Manama, these changes have the potential over generations, and it will take generations, to alter the baseline impressions of Moroccans and Emiratis and Bahrainis and how they view Israelis and the state of Israel. The reality is many of the baseline and most important opportunities associated with the Abraham Accords are still yet to come. As the working groups mature and their plans are more fulsomely developed and implemented, my sense is what you'll see is not just increased connectivity between governments and leading commercial entities in Israel, but normalized relations and greater engagement between educators, doctors, nurses, farmers, hydrologists, professionals across a variety of sectors, Israelis and Arabs working together in a much more fulsome manner, not just governments, but the people themselves. I think there's also a reasonable expectation and hope that the Abraham Accords will expand. And I think in some capitals, there's probably a greater willingness and potential for it to happen sooner than in others. In Saudi Arabia, for example, King Salman said he will not normalize ties with Israel until there's a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But despite this, multiple media reports indicate that both military and business ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia are expanding. And if Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, were to take the throne sooner rather than later, it would not be a surprise to see him recognize and normalize relations with Israel sooner as well. It's not clear that he and his father see eye to eye on this particular issue. Riyadh has no interest in falling greatly behind Abu Dhabi or Manama when it comes to acquiring and using Israeli technology or capabilities it does not currently have access to, or engaging in being a leading trade partner for these technologies with Israel. For Israel, normalizing ties with Saudi Arabia, even without normalizing with the rest of the region, would be a truly momentous opportunity. In part because of the political leadership of Saudi Arabia in the region, stemming from its size and wealth, but also due to the religious authority inherent in the king's position as the custodian of the two holy mosques, a reference, of course, to the two holiest mosques in Islam, the Great Mosque in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. At the same time, while most countries, for instance, Oman and Tunisia, are focused inward and not viewing normalization as a priority, it's possible to envision their willingness to normalize eventually as well, especially if they see the benefits from normalizing are demonstrably impacting in a positive manner the actual populations of the countries like Morocco that have normalized. And by this, I mean, if the populations are seeing an overall per capita GDP increase, in part due to normalization with Israel. Conversely, there are other countries who are making it harder to envision normalization at any point in even the distant future. Iraq's recent passing of a law making it a crime for even everyday Iraqis not associated with the government to befriend or engage with Israelis makes it difficult to envision even low-key ties in the near term. For the US, the Abraham Accords remain an integral part of US foreign policy in the Middle East, and one of the few policies that has bipartisan support, with both Democrats and Republicans supporting the Accords, as well as pushing for the expansion of them. something I'd expect the US to continue to do with Riyadh most prominently, but also probably with Muscat, Tunis, maybe even Kuwait City eventually as well. Given US prioritization of the Accords, it should come as no surprise that the US remains intimately involved in helping to convene meetings and pushing the working groups to stand up as Washington seeks to ensure the Accords live up to their full potential, ushering in not just enhanced relations between Israel and Arab states, but transformational change for citizens of these countries. Sudan, however, is an example that demonstrates the limits of the Accords. The nature of the coup d'etat in Sudan last year, for instance, makes it challenging to believe that normalization can continue at the same pace it is elsewhere, especially given US condemnation of Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. While the coup hasn't completely stopped normalization efforts, they're surely more rocky today given US objections to and condemnation of Burhan's continuing role as Sudan's de facto leader. As Sudan demonstrates, countries themselves have to be politically stable internally and externally for the Abraham Accords to be successful. Internally, they have to be able to deal with public opposition, given that in most Arab countries, the population still have a negative view of Israel. Externally, countries need stable leadership with individuals who are viewed as credible by Israel and at times by the US as well. US interest in the Accords will remain high, however, in part due to US equities in the region, for instance, on regional security. The potential for the Accords to prompt greater integrated defense systems, coordination, training, and information sharing could help to create a better security network and defense bulwark against emerging and ongoing threats in the Middle East, ranging from Iran to militants and terrorist groups operating throughout the region. The US will need to take a leading role in these efforts, given how much of Middle East states' trainings and weapons are supplied by the US. But the opportunity for Middle East states to undertake greater integration with each other has the potential to greatly strengthen the region's security architecture in the decade to come. At the end of the day, the Abraham Accords won't be a panacea for every conflict, but they do have the potential to have a meaningful impact on the lives of people across the region. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I hope you enjoy the conference.
All right, so that was Mr. Jonathan Panikov presentation. And with that, we have concluded today's presentations. And now I'd like to open the floor for open discussion. And I'll start with the following question. And whoever's gonna wanna answer, please. So can you elaborate more on how your personal experience enhanced face-to-face connections? Sure, go ahead, please, Riazi.
Okay, I think this question is very close to my heart. I can truly say that through the people-to-people interactions that I've experienced with the citizens of Israel, especially even at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies and with Brandon, that it's a very bright and peaceful future for both nations. I have interned for the center for a month, during which we had a joint conference where I worked very tightly with the members of the center in organizing the first joint conference with an Emirati-based think tank. But for my personal experience as an Emirati, it was very exciting to be able to look at the unfiltered lens of who Israelis really are through their welcoming, helpful, tolerant qualities. I also want to extend my sincere thanks to the Moshe Dayan Center and Brandon for making me feel like I was home. I believe that I was one of the lucky ones that had that opportunity to actually sit down and listen. And by listening, I mean not just listen to answer, but to listen and understand the decisions that were made and said, and understand the ideas that were behind them. I believe the people-to-people connections I experienced, especially at the Moshe Dayan Center, is that I did not build connections with the other side, but I built friendships with individuals that share a similar identity, which is the Middle Eastern identity. I believe the people-to-people connections enhances and develops all the other aspects. It teaches you to speak, hear, and to sit down with individuals despite our religion, culture, and values. There also must be an end to all the negative public propaganda. Media and social media networking should be used to advocate the mutual respect rather than the opposite. There should be acknowledgement of the rights of all indigenous people to their indigenous lands and resources and properties. There must be components to any practical and viable roadmap for cultural diplomacy and peace in our region. Being a part of a region that's known to be one of the most youthful regions in the world, I believe it is our responsibility to build the bridge to the new Middle East. We must not forget, as the youth, we're not just the future, but we're now and tomorrow. So it's where it starts with us, build people-to-people connections and get the chance to look through the unfiltered lens of who Israelis really are.
Thank you so much.
I'll just add 2 words. First of all, thank you, Yazi, for all those compliments. You're making me blush. It was a pleasure having you, and I want to just on a more broad perspective add this, that I think that one of the things, Tobias, you had raised it, is whether the Abraham Accords is in some way a means to shift the conversation away from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yossi, you made a couple of very interesting and astute remarks about the Abraham Accords and the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian effort. As someone, and this is just my anecdotal experience in dealing with the Emiratis, in almost every serious conversation I've had with them, no one's tried to shift the conversation away from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It comes up again and again. And I think that one of the interesting things, and Yossi, you alluded to this as well, was that the Abraham Accords, to some degree, rescued, depending on where your politics are, rescued the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from the annexation of portions of the Jordan Valley, which would have been a very explosive issue to a certain degree. And I think it's important to understand that context as well, right? So I think if we think about the person-to-person exchange, and here I want to get back to the state and society issue, the Emirates, like almost any other place, and this goes from my experience with the Bahrainis as well, is there's probably a range of issues and opinions with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I don't think that there's any grand plan to, and I don't think anyone in Israel is naive to think that the Abraham Accords will somehow allow everyone to ignore the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I think to a certain degree what the Abraham Accords does is it delinks the issue from Israel's relationships with others in the neighborhood. And even then, even with, if we accept this notion that it somehow delinks the issue and allows Israel and its neighbors to pursue their own autonomous, independent relationships, it's important to understand that we recognize that everyone's still mindful of this issue. We understand it's not going away, and we don't pretend that to believe that it is. And I think that one of the most refreshing experiences, to get back to the person-to-person aspect of things, is just the opportunity to sit down and be able to exchange ideas on these very sensitive issues and understand that there may not be perfect harmony.
If I may add, and I fully agree with Brandon, I think for those of us who grew up in Israel, which you couldn't cross any border in the region and just take your passport and meet people, sometimes we almost need to pinch ourselves to believe that this is happening. And this is is normalization in Paris. This is normal. This is the new normal. And, you know, being involved, as you know, with Trends as a fellow, even before the Abraham Accord, all this idea that, you know, we talk to each other, we listen to each other, we exchange opinions. This is so refreshing, and probably should have been many years ago, but it didn't. And it was a long process. You know, probably started in the 1970s with the peace process and agreement with Egypt, and moved maybe in a slower pace that some of us would have liked to, but still it's here. And I think we need to make the most of it. At the same time, I agree, what we can learn when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we can learn two different things. I think, you know, the lesson I learned, it's, you know, for many years, again, those of us who grew in certain times in Israel, the idea that all the region is hostile. So it's not hostile anymore, and almost not resolving the Palestinian issue derives from the, oh, we can't make concessions because it's a hostile environment. But now it's not a hostile environment anymore, because, you know, the longest border with Jordan, all in all, is a peaceful border. The one in Egypt, the strategic cooperation level that many didn't expect. It may be not the warmest of pieces as the normalization with the UAE, and then the opening of the relations with the Gulf. So actually, you can look at it either as a great opportunity and create this confidence, the building that's required to make the concession as part of a peace with the Palestinians. But unfortunately, some people within the Israeli society might draw exactly the opposite conclusion. Why do we need it at all? Everything is so good. Why do we need to make any conclusion? And I think this is part of the debate in the Israeli society, which I think should be also a frank discussion with part of the Abraham Accord.
Thank you everyone for your input. Dr. Tobias, would you like to add on this topic?
I mean, I'm very, very conscious of the fact that amongst my distinguished panelists here, I'm the only one who is not either in Israel, from Israel, or indeed from the Middle East at all. But I do think, you know, I think all of your points really resonate, and I think the important thing is that they are, as Yossi says, a new kind of debate, right? And even if that debate has been around for many years in various circles, now it is more at the surface, right? And we have people like yourselves, like you, Eliezer, and you, Brandon, you know, talking about these kinds of exchanges in a very public way and in a very positive way. And I think that is surely, if nothing else, that is an enormous achievement of these Abraham Accords. I do think, you know, my work tends to be looking at the sort of bigger strategic picture. At that level, we do have those big questions to answer of how those people-to-people ties translate into strategic developments. To what extent, yeah, it is about being inclusive versus broadening in a club that others might never have access to. So I think those questions do remain, but I do think in general, it is clearly one of the most significant developments in regional politics and in the Middle East over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And I think one of the things that I find particularly important, and Yossi alluded to this in his presentation, is that that the rest of the world wakes up to it. And in particularly that Europe wakes up to it, since I am a European, both British and German. So I do worry that in Europe, we have come to see, or initially the Abraham Accords were perceived as a sort of, almost as a gimmick, right? As a Trump gimmick, right? That these were a Trump thing. It wasn't really anything real. And I've heard from many people, oh, you know, just this can be reversed really quickly, or as soon as Trump is gone, this is going to be over, and so on. But I think actually, whether it's in Washington or in London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, I think folks are starting to wake up to the idea and the reality, really, that the Abraham Accords are more than a Trump gimmick, that the Trump involvement, however important it might have been, really wasn't the driving factor. That this is, like I said in my remarks, a regional, a push from within the region, from countries within the region, from leaders within the region, of course, but also from the people. And I'm hopeful that European countries and other countries around the world too, but mostly European countries, are beginning to wake up to that and are starting to think about how to not be left behind, I guess. Yeah, those would be my thoughts on this one.
Thank you, everyone. And actually, Dr. Tobias and a few of other speakers actually brought the US's, the US's aspect to their cause. So this is an open question too. So how do you see the difference between Biden and Trump's administration approach toward the Accords? If anyone would like to answer that.
I mean, I'm happy to start on that.
Yes.
I think the Biden administration has gone through precisely this process that I just outlined, right? There were quite a lot of people within the Democratic Party who saw the Abraham Accords as a Trump policy, and therefore, just as Trump, arguably ripped up the JCPOA for few other reasons than that it was signed by President Obama, there were quite a few people, I think, in the Democratic Party who initially thought, day one, we'll get rid of these achievements of the Trump administration. Now, that thankfully didn't happen. But I think also it obviously didn't happen because of, partly perhaps because of a slightly different approach to politics, but also I think because of a growing recognition of, just like I just said, that the Abraham Accords are not a US policy, that they're not a US initiative, that they are from the region itself. So I think there has been, over the last 2 years since the Biden administration came into office, a sort of gradual process of, coming to terms with and recognition that actually the Democratic Party and the Biden administration can't afford to allow something like the Abraham Accords to become seen as a purely Trump initiative. That's why I think, at least in the rhetoric of the Biden administration ahead of its visit to the president's visit to Saudi Arabia, there was a lot of talk about how one of the key objectives of this was in fact not the big elephant in the room at the time, energy and oil, etc., but actually trying to, facilitate closer engagement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So clearly the Biden administration has woken up to the fact that it wants to make this part of its policy too. Personally, I'm hopeful that, of course, we don't know what happens in 2024, but that something like the Abraham Accords will be allowed to continue to expand, continue to develop, continue to mature without being subject to the extremes of US politics and the extremes of the pendulum swinging back and forth, and people making foreign policy decisions, strategic decisions on the basis of what is really fundamental, dispute over domestic politics. So that's why I see things. At the moment, I do think there has been actually quite a lot of alignment on this.
Thank you, Dr. Tobias. Other speakers?
I think one of the big changes, I think the way Tobias explained the evolution of the Biden administration's approach to the Abraham Accords is quite accurate, and I don't have much to add to it, but I do want to make 2 points. First of all, I think what's been valuable, and we heard a little bit about this during Jonathan Panikoff's remarks, is that to me, one of the new features of regional politics since the Abraham Accords has been this emphasis on multilateralism or mini-lateralism, if you will, which is something truly new in the region, which really hasn't had too many multilateral, I would say effective and functioning multilateral forum in the modern history of the region. whether it's the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, the newly referred to as Negev Summit. We've heard of, there was a recent summit in Egypt. There are these small groupings that are coming together, and the US, or at least the Biden administration, seems to be bandwagoning on them and throwing American support, which is not marginal. It's an important thing behind them. And I think if we take Tobias's remarks that we're seeing the region sort of try to take things into its own hands and initiate regional solutions, if you will, the Americans seem willing now, or at least much more willing than perhaps they were in the first 6 months, to support them. And I think that that's an important development. So if I had to put my finger on something different, just comparing Biden from the first 6 months of its administration now to the last 6 months, I would say that's an important change to recognize. And perhaps an important change to the continuing success and sustainability of these multilateral, minilateral fora, which I think are important to the overall success of the Abraham Accords. Just one more small point with respect to Jordan, because it was raised as a big question. I think it is a really important issue. The Abraham Accords has made an effort to incorporate Jordan and reach out to Jordan. I think Israel certainly recognizes Jordan's importance. And if we want to link it to the Biden question, you know, one of Biden's first Middle Eastern conversations was with King Abdullah of Jordan. And I don't think it was one that King Abdullah particularly was happy with. And I think as a result, you know, we've seen this deal, which is potentially also a historic deal, where the UAE is investing in new water and energy technologies, where solar powered energy will be given to Israel in the form of electricity, and Israel will provide desalination and water solutions, something Jordan desperately needs, and it'll be financed by the Emiratis. And this is something where you see the Abraham Accords scope is being widened. Now, does that mean that the Jordanians are fully on board with everything related to the Abraham Accords? No, there are important issues to resolve, and the Palestinian issue for the Jordanians is one of immense importance. However, there are steps being taken in which the Abraham Accords we don't necessarily need to see normalization on the scale that we saw with the Abraham Accords for there to be progress. And I think that this deal with, you know, water, solar investment is a good example of how the Abraham Accords can be leveraged and address some of the big questions, Tobias, I think that you referred to. Again, I think that there are going to be shades of gray when it comes to these new regional groupings and interactions. They won't make everyone happy or to the exact same extent, but they do, I would say they show an important sense of capacity in the region. And we're a region where capacity is lacking in a lot of parts, whether it's, you know, the ongoing wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, or general governance and instability. Where there is capacity, it needs to be strengthened, recognized, and reinforced. I'll stop there.
Maybe if I can add just one word about it. I don't think there was expectation that Biden will change the approach towards the Abraham Accords. You will expect continuity, the same way that no one expected that, for instance, Biden will reverse the decision to move the American embassy, the US embassy, to Jerusalem. It's great dynamic, and then it accepts it whether they would have initiated in the first place or not. This is the nature of continuity between administration. The question, what happens if there is a crisis, how much the United States will be ready to invest in reinforcing the Abraham Accord. I think there, and as all relations, they are going through tests, and there will be tests to the Abraham Accords. And at this point of you know, there will be pressure on the Abraham Accords and the relations, you know, it can derive from the Palestinian issue, it can derive from issues with to do with Iran and other issues. If at this point, whatever administration is there, is going to be and say, no, this is an American interest to ensure that the Abraham Accord stays there and gets stronger and stronger. The other thing, we live in a world which countries more and more, though the need is actually to work together and globally because of the nature of the challenges, the opposite does happen. So, you know, populism and the need to be elected one way or another. And that's definitely something that happens, the divisiveness, the partisan approach in the United States, it probably deserves a different symposium altogether. Create a sort of, that even the things that the parties, you would expect them to agree, they agree for the sake of disagreeing, because this is the nature of the discourse in the United States, as in some other places in the world. And I think this will, again, can pose a challenge when, if the Abraham Accord itself facing some difficulties.
Thank you so much, everyone, for answering that question. And actually, Professor Yossi, this question is directed to you, since you gave us a European perspective. I just wanted to ask, and of course, everyone is free to answer this. What can we expect from the new UK Prime Minister on this topic?
Well, you put me on the spot on this one, because actually there is not even a new prime minister now. There is a leader of the Conservative Party that, until she won't meet the Queen in Scotland, as it happens, he's not the prime minister. But let's assume all goes well, and she is the prime minister very, very soon. It's a good question. Again, let's put like this: democracy is a great thing, but I can't come here and say that's the debate in the Conservative Party cover themselves, the different contenders, they cover themselves with glory. And if we believe half of what they say about each other, we should all worry here about the future. But again, this is the nature of politics sometimes. And now it's, you know, down to business and to really address so many issues. And there is no way out of it. The United Kingdom faces a major crisis. There is a crisis of leadership. There is crisis within the Conservative Party, which will be very, very difficult to resolve overnight. It's a divided. We're 2 years before maximum, before the next election. There is cost of living crisis, let alone energy prices. There is obviously the war in Ukraine. So there are so many issues. Liz Truss instinctively is supporting basically everything that Israel thinks and says. And that will be interesting to see what kind of relations would develop. Is she going as a prime minister to be more critical? I don't think so. So I think in many sense, you know, you would expect the UK, again, I don't want it to distinguish from European policies, because we haven't seen that when it comes to the Middle East, the UK actually develops different policies altogether. I think, again, we're also recovering from Brexit, and this is something that won't happen overnight. It's a matter of years. But at this point, I think the relations with the economic relations with countries outside the European Union will dictate much of the way that the new government is going to handle its business. But, you know, you can't really know about a new prime minister that couldn't actually make up her mind whether the president of France is a friend or foe when she was asked recently. So how she's going to deal with the rest of the world, it's a very good question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sure. Please.
Can I just add one thought to that? I think, you know, first of all, completely agree with everything Yossi said, but I think there's one wider point that he raises that I do think applies for other European governments, for that matter, for the United States too. And that's one of bandwidth, right? We're in a moment where there's so many issues on the table, where the number one security and strategic question for any European, any Western government is going to be Russia and Ukraine. And then China is a sort of close second, and we saw the opprobrium around, you know, the Taiwan question. So at that time, the Middle East really comes quite low on the list, on the agenda when it comes to foreign policy, apart from, of course, on the energy question, where the Middle East is sort of bouncing up and down on the list of priorities. So, but still, I think that is, unfortunately, I think that the sort of frame through which we have to understand external countries, certainly Western countries, engagement with the region over the next few years is one of very limited bandwidth. Of course, if there's a crisis, there's going to be a reaction. Of course, there's going to be commercial and trading engagement, particularly for a country like the UK that's looking for a post-Brexit future. But as it comes to the strategic questions, I think on that, seeing anything other than sort of muddling through, I think is somewhat unlikely.
I would just add one quick point, not relating to the prospective British Prime Minister, but I agree that the Middle East is certainly not a European priority, but something that's interesting from the Israeli perspective is there does seem to be some renewed European interest in defense issues with respect to the Middle East in light of the war in Ukraine. At least in my anecdotal experience, there does seem to be a renewed sense of European engagement with Israel, and not just Israel, because Israel is increasingly engaged jointly in some of these defense-related issues in what we're doing here. And I think that that's quite interesting. It's not just energy, it's also to a certain degree defense. And so I just add that as a minor footnote. I think broadly your point is absolutely correct.
Thank you everyone for answering that question actually. And before concluding today's session, I'd like to actually give the opportunity to our speakers to give any concluding remarks, key points or recommendations.
I'm happy to make my concluding remarks, but I feel like I should defer to my co-panelists here.
The floor is yours.
Okay. So I guess I feel sort of as a scholar and analyst most comfortable talking about what I would say are the strategic and analytical issues. But I think at the end of the day, Aliazia's points are probably the most important, the people-to-people engagement. In terms of the ability to sustain and expand these agreements, certainly we have a tendency to focus on interests and questions relating to geopolitics and strategy, but there are huge demographic changes underway in our region, and ultimately the potential for the Abraham Accords to create a new pattern of relationships between peoples, I think is where we need to keep the focus. And so I would just say, particularly to those who may not know our region as well, it really is hard to overstate what Yazia said. Yossi, I think you emphasized this as well, is really the opportunity to engage one another in a meaningful way. And perhaps for our children and grandchildren to do so as well is an incredibly hopeful message, and one that I'm happy to embrace as a cynical pessimist by nature. So thank you again all for the opportunity to be with you today, and I wish you much success and a productive conference. My thanks to everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Brandon Freeman. So anyone else? Anyone would like to add remarks to this session?
I think I already gave my conclusion, but it wouldn't be wrong for me to say it again. I think in a very fast-changing, complex, post-COVID world, and out of my personal experience, I think that the youth can be the bridge to a better future through new values, through the track 3 diplomacy, through the culture diplomacy that we talked about. Fortunately, the Accords has created a new culture in the tutorial space of the Accords countries, which is the culture of the people-to-people connections. And based on that connection, culture diplomacy can succeed in building a sustainable peace and developed Middle East.
Thank you so much, Aliazia. Professor Yossi, you was going to say something?
Yeah, I just completely agree with both Elvin and Brandon. I think, it's something, Brandon, you said that, when we look as analysts about the strategy, we sometimes so immerse ourselves with what generals and diplomats do, and we forget that actually it's all about people. At the end of the day, it's about the security of individuals and families, and it's about the prosperity of everyone. And in this sense, the Abraham Accords exactly represent the opportunity for us to know each other and to build on this. And we just can hope that in the future, this what the Abraham Accord represent will only expand, and more people actually we have the opportunity and also participating in this kind of discussion. And the more we do that, and the more we see the human side of it and what we can do, that's when we collaborate and cooperate with each other instead of fighting with one another, the better not only the Middle East will come, but the entire world. So it gives us a ray of hope, a ray of sunshine in regions that sometimes can be quite dark. So let's make sure that there is more of it.
Thank you, Professor Yossi. Dr. Tobias?
I just want to underscore and support everything my three fellow panelists have said. And I think maybe I can add one other sort of appeal, but that would be an appeal to European governments, and for that matter, the US government too, but just do pay attention, right? Do pay attention to these developments in the region, and not just to the big strategic picture that we tend to sort of see and at least keep an eye on, but also, and importantly, to those societal developments, the people-to-people engagement, the new ideas that emerge from that for joint solutions to common problems, including such big things such as climate change and so on. So I think, yeah, my appeal would be to European governments in particular, since I am a European, but also to others, is to pay attention. And don't be left behind.
Perfect. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for sharing their regional and scholarly perspective on the Abraham Accords topic. It has been an absolute pleasure to be your moderator in this session. Thank you so much, everyone.